Welcome to this workshop on climate justice and the working class - do they belong together? So anyway, without further ado, I'll just introduce myself before I introduce everybody else. My name is John Sinner. I'm an activist who's based in London. I've been involved in the climate movement in Northern Europe. For instance, I was involved with the COP15. I've lived in the Netherlands. I've worked with the climate movement there. I am involved in a group called 1 Million Climate Jobs, and this meeting is being called in their name. So we produced this pamphlet in English, and it's had quite an impact. I've contributed to this, and yeah, that's basically who I am. And then we have immediately to my right is Tadzio Mueller, who's quite a well-known climate justice activist amongst the climate justice movement in Europe. He's been active at least since Copenhagen. At least since Seattle, but at least definitely on the climate movement I can testify he's been involved at least since Copenhagen. And he works for the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. He's a writer, speaker, and an activist, and he's also heavily involved in the Ende Gelände movement, which is having a huge impact on Germany's brown coal industry and mobilizing and radicalizing a new generation of climate activists in Germany. And then further we have Chihiro Geuzebroek, who is activist based in the Netherlands. She's professionally a documentary maker that have won awards on the question on Bolivia and the issue of climate justice. And she's also a member of the International Socialists in the Netherlands. One of three questions we need to consider is: one, do we consider that, for instance, Western workers materially benefit from the exploitation of third world? That's one question we might need to consider. The other is what relationship, as climate activists, because we do see them in actions, how do we build that relationship, and should we even try? And third, do we consider that the working class, to put it in a better term, do you think they have been bought off? Are they one-dimensional, as Marcuse said, and have they been seduced by the shiny glitter of capitalism and cannot be won over to an anti-capitalist perspective? So these are the questions I hope we can consider in this discussion.
Energy. Wow. Okay, so I'm gonna try to speak up, but if you can't hear me, please just do this, because so to start this talk, I would like to do a small check-in with who we are here. So when we're talking about climate justice and worker struggle, my first question is there anybody here that's in a union? Raise your hand. So that's maybe 5 people? Can I count? 6. Okay. Then who would identify as being part of the bigger workers' struggle? Hands. So about the same people. Then who would consider themselves to be a climate activist?
Can we say justice?
That's my final question. And who would consider themselves to be a climate justice activist? Okay, so cool. That was the small check-in just to see with who we are here today and discuss. I'd like to start when I read the little synopsis of this meeting is kind of my jumping off start, because I don't want to compete with that in voice and volume. So the first question is, this dichotomy between ecology and economy. We often hear in capitalist media it's jobs or it's environment, and I hope everyone here already knows that that is a false dichotomy, but I would like to start there with the analysis of what goes wrong there. So this fake schism, when we look at ecology and economy, any linguist would first notice that they have the same root, eco, coming from Greek oikos, which means home or place of dwelling. So when we talk that jobs and environment are at war with each other, we're talking about the home and the household management being at war with each other, which would be rather strange if you consider that. More loud. Okay, this is action training for me. Okay, so what we've got is an economy locked into a toxic ideology. So capitalism in which you only get to exist to the extent that you violate others, that you violate your home, that you violate the home of others. So when we talk that ecology and jobs are at war, I would actually like to say ecology and capitalism are mutually antagonistic or exclusive. So often capitalism is understood as this system which creates surplus, and the surplus managers are exploiting the rest. And recently I was listening to somebody and he was talking about how capitalism is creating a deficit of public goods, and that when we want growth, we should aim for growth in public goods such as education or woods or aquifers or ejidos like they have in Mexico, the common land. So what that means for strategy is that we need to destroy sociopathic commodities and dismantle free-to-exploit trade pacts. Another implication would be to halt the type of technological escalation that only is expressed through violating communities and public well-being. So why do I say that? Because when we look at the fight against capitalism, there's a really big strategic reason to include workers in your struggle. Because workers have, in the capitalist system, are best positioned as a class to wage that struggle, not because of moral superiority or for suffering the most, because that's not necessarily true, but it's strategically placed because workers have the most direct relationship with capital as they produce it. So far, that sounds like I'm a socialist saying, hey, workers' class is going to be the one to bring climate justice in. But there is a complication in my vision because, as I see, workers have not been historically the ones to protect 80% of biodiversity. That's the indigenous, which are only comprised of 5% of the world population, but they're the ones guarding the biodiversity. And I haven't seen a worker struggle that is striking to protect snails or to protect your local medicinal plant or the rights of a river. So one thing that, I don't know, were there any people present at the opening speech of Vandana Shiva at the alternative top? Yeah, 1, 2, 3, awesome. So one thing that really stuck to me was that she said, she intervened, we shouldn't be fighting for jobs. Jobs are we should be fighting for livelihoods, and jobs is what is done to you when you are stolen of your livelihood. You get jobbed when you're taken off your land is robbed, and they put you in a mine. And then you're dependable. You're dependable because you need to make money to have a license to operate, to exist on planet Earth. So this is a big problem that I see for worker struggle, even though they're the best to wage a hindrance or dismantle the infrastructure of capitalism. The vision is with other groups in our societies that are most invisibilized. They exist, but our colonizing cultures are there's this term of firsting and lasting. I don't know if anybody has ever heard of that. No. Okay, so firsting and lasting is what happens if you look at the American history. They talk about the first university here or the first settlement over there, and that's bringing white culture somewhere. It's the first, it's the bringer of modernity. But on the other hand, you have the last of the Mohicans, the last battle against the last stand of this, and it refers to indigenous fight back. So it's a narrative in which indigenous modernity is erased, and it's only allowed to exist in folklore, in cultural dress, or in a song, but not as a form of governance. And little people know that today in Turtle Island there are over 590 governments of indigenous nations that are finding their way to deal with complexity of living in colonized land and guarding their sovereignty. So
Turtle Island being the name given by these people to what we call the US or
Yeah.
North America.
yeah,
So just-
yeah. Thank you for clearing
sorry,
that up.
because the
Yeah.
Turtle Island is not, you imagine tiny island. It's like a big island, North America.
Turtle Island, what the colonizers call the U.S. today. I wanted to, in this introduction, to first put the focus on the difficulty of having a workers' class that is best equipped to deal with dismantling capitalism, but is poorer equipped in terms of vision or cosmovision to wage that struggle, because everything tend to be boxed in around labor and human-centric goals instead of biocentric goals. So I'm very curious how we can pick that up in the discussion. And finally, there's one more complication, and that's the difference between the ends of previous empires that were fought and toppled and the current empire. That difference is global ecological collapse. Empires are always based not only on the exploitation of the poor, but on the existence of new frontiers. And what we see today is that those new frontiers are proposed as Mars, as a new planet to colonize. But that's just not that feasible if we do a reality check-in. I have some examples from personal struggle in the Netherlands that I hope to get into the discussion. But I wanted to start with just a little bit of analysis of how I enter this debate of worker struggle in climate justice. I'd love to give the floor to Tadzio Mueller, and then maybe we can discuss as a group.
Right. First of all, thank you very much. I'm glad to see that we've got a properly Marxist panel going on here. And I have certainly for a long time considered myself a kind of communist, and that means that you have a particular relationship to the history of workers' struggles. But since I've become a climate justice activist, I've also found that there's something slightly simplistic in the way we tend to say what we want is to leave fossil fuels in the ground immediately, and we want a just transition for workers and communities. Because, and this will be hopefully only the depressing midpoint of the next 10 minutes, and then some sort of uplifting thing I'll figure out between now and then. Leaving fossil fuels in the ground now and having a just transition for workers and communities don't live in the same universe, because there's literally not a single. Does anyone know what a just transition is supposed to be? A just transition for workers and communities refers to the idea that, of course, you have to say shut down, jobs in coal mining and coal plants, etc., but that there will be some kind of just transition, and I mean it exactly. It's about as fuzzy as that, for these workers. I don't know, some other industries that are built up with state support or solidarity economies that make up for the shortfall in livelihoods. Problem is, so I work for the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and a few years ago we sent out a researcher, gave him quite a bit of money and said, hey, come back with some examples of a just transition. He came back a year later with a 3-page text. saying, no, sorry, couldn't find any. And I'm not like, I'm trying to make this sound a bit funny because it's really fucking depressing. So, because it is kind of that. So, and I wanted to just, I wanted to kind of really start with a little story. Who was at Ende Gelände last year? Ende Gelände 2016? Oh, no, Ende Gelände only had one action last year. There was the Rhineland action, which was the climate camp. But Lausitz. Yeah. Okay, cool. Now, so you may remember the disastrous, one of the disastrous closing elements of an amazing, unbelievably powerful weekend was that our blockades got attacked by a mob of locals, Nazis, and people waving mining union flags. Now, footnote, the miners' union says that these people weren't from the miners' union, that their flags, quote, get taken frequently at demonstrations and presumably stored downstairs in the basement to beat people up with. Now, maybe these were mining union people or not, but basically a coalition of workers, Nazis, and locals attacked climate justice activists. Now, the question that many asked themselves at the camp later on is, why do they hate us? And the point really is, well, it's a bit like when Americans asked that question after 9/11. It's like, oh, come on, you can figure this out. In essence, we are saying, people, your jobs have to be shut down, because although it is sort of in general, it is in general true, like workers produce capital, they have the power. In reality, sort of empirically on the ground, the work that these people are doing is organized by these big firms. These big firms' profit interest is to get this stuff out of the ground and burn it, and that way these workers generate their livelihoods. Now, we are saying the way you generate your livelihoods also means that people around the world die, particularly brown people who don't actually have the livelihoods that you have. Footnote, coal workers next to Volkswagen workers are some of the best protected workers in Germany. So our point is, correctly, well, what you're doing destroys the planet. Ergo, I mean, sure, we want to shut down RWE and Vattenfall and these big companies, and we want to socialize them and have a sort of democratically controlled, socialized renewable energy system. But what happens with the workers? We're actually telling them your jobs have to end, and they have to end pretty much now, because we can't keep digging up lignite. So then, because we don't want to be assholes, we say things like, well, but we were calling for a just transition for you people. And then they're like, yeah, but what would that look like? And we have to be honest and say, we have no idea. Then the next move, this debate you've probably all had or heard, the next move is, well, what about the renewables industry? There's only 20,000 or 60,000 jobs in coal if you count the last hairdresser and school teacher teaching the kids of coal workers. So there's 60,000 jobs in lignite in Germany and maybe about 400,000 in renewables. So you're like, yeah, that's great, right? Why don't you guys work in renewables? Except that then we end up sounding like a bunch of neoliberal green assholes, because we're just saying, well, sorry your sector died. Why don't you move somewhere else, be somewhere else, and do something else? Without the protection of good contracts, because the renewables industry in Germany has shit contracts, extremely low union penetration, so there's a very low degree of union organizing in that sector, and it's also just they have to move and go somewhere else.
Isn't it because it's a new sector? Because it's so young.
Hang on, I'm just talking about the realities of it. I'm not why this is the case, and I think you explained most of the things in general exactly as I would. But on the ground, if you tell somebody in Lusatia whose family has been in coal mining for 70 years that now they have to move to Rostock, up north on the coast, and do something totally different, they're first of all saying, well, but I can't just uproot my life and go somewhere else and be somewhere else. It doesn't work that way. Secondly, the jobs in the coal mining industry are connected to a sense of pride and identity that hardly any other kind of work can muster. There is a saying in Lusatia which essentially translates as, I'm a miner, let someone else be something better. Ungefähr so, ich bin Bergarbeiter, wer ist mehr. And that means that when we're saying leave fossil fuels in the ground, sofortiger Kohleausstieg, we're effectively saying we're going to not only destroy your livelihoods, which, footnote, may be sort of like, given Germany does have a reasonably okay welfare system at this point, so you could say, well, sure, you can find the money to survive, But what about identity? What about culture? What about a sense of self? What about a sense of history, which we know is what makes human life livable? You can't just, we're not just people who live off of bread and water. We want bread and roses, I think, is the line, right? And so this is essentially the real problem that I feel myself stuck in. It's like, so I'm a communist, so I'm all like, yeah, you know, workers' rights, except capital, yes, it exploits workers and sort of alienates them, but at the same time it also just destroys livelihoods of people whom you know, we would maybe, who are maybe campesinos, or who aren't working class in a narrow sense at all. And why should it be more important for us to consider the interests of folks in Cottbus or in the Rhineland who are going to end up on the dole, rather than people in Bangladesh who are going to drown? So from a communist perspective, I'd say, well, first of all, ethically speaking, it's the people who are going to drown who matter more. Now, you correctly point out that in the Marxist tradition, we've always assumed, well, the working class is uniquely placed to overthrow capitalism because it doesn't only have an interest to overthrow capitalism, it also has the capability because of its strategic positioning in the production process. I agree with the point about the capability. However, I would challenge the assertion that at this point in time, the empirically existing working class has an empirically identifiable real interest in overthrowing capitalism, because their livelihoods are tied to it. Therefore, the classic Marxian analysis doesn't quite work, which is a real problem, because the groups that have an interest in overthrowing the global capitalist system don't necessarily have the strategic positioning to do so, and the groups who have the strategic position to do so don't necessarily have the interest. And it really is frustrating as hell. This discussion about this notion just transition, which again, just transition is sort of the label attached, that kind of, let's say, that eco-leftists have started to use to talk about a climate policy that is not just taking, you know, bearing in mind the interests of indigenous folks in Bolivia, or of fishermen in the Philippines, but also the interests of workers here. We've said we need a just transition for workers and communities. But as a matter of fact, as it is now, we do not have any realistic proposals for what that could look like. And I'm coming to an end now. The actual effect of this call for a just transition has been to slow down the discussion about a coal phase out, about an exit from coal in Germany. Because we say we want a Kohleausstieg, a coal phase out now. And then we say, and we want a just transition. And then the workers are saying, okay, what's your idea of a just transition? And we're like, we're still kind of trying to work that out. And they're like, you know what? Under those circumstances, we will continue fighting you people. Because you say that you are sort of going to act in our interest, but you don't really have anything to put on the table. And while I do detest the German mining union, and they're one of the most reactionary union outfits that are allowed to organize in the German Trade Union Confederation, they have a point when they say, we're going to fight your proposals for a coal phase out because you have nothing even remotely close to what it is that we have now, which is some of the best protected jobs in Germany, that you can offer our membership. And that is where I'm going to end. At this point, the question asked, why do they hate us? Is because we are, in fact, their enemy. And we do not have real proposals for how their lives could be, could look, and could be better. And I'm done. And so that's where I'm stuck right now. And I hope this discussion can take us a bit further, because being stuck is a horrible place, and we do need to, you know, hurry. Over. Wiggle around too much. Okay, that was that. Sorry if that was depressing.
So I have things to say to that, but first maybe it's good to...
I think so, yeah.
That was what I was going to say. First do a check-in if there are questions. Or comments, for that matter.
Somebody wants to cry a little bit.
But otherwise, I can give a really interesting example of where we're at the Netherlands. Because one thing I didn't get into now is where I stand in climate justice activism in the Netherlands. So in the Netherlands for a long time we've been looking at Germany and we've been like, wow, Ende Gelände.
Oh, do go on.
So a few years ago, like, I don't know, maybe 13 people of the Netherlands came to Ende Gelände, and then there was a human chain and maybe 50 people came. And then in 2015, we had a few buses and maybe 50 to 70 people came. And last year in Lausitz, I think we were at least 150 or something from the Netherlands. So we've been kind of coming of a Dutch climate movement that was only talking polar bears and ppm, very NGO, very carbon oriented, and very little justice. And so the only moments that climate was in the street was with some international climate march or something that 350 would call, and then it was like, oh, okay, we'll do something too. Maybe do a little bit in divestment. But with, and after Copenhagen, of course, there was a drop of people that were already active, but I think that goes for a lot of countries in Europe that suffered after Copenhagen from some depression or something. So what has happened this year is that from this experience we've gained in Ende Gelände, we made a next step in the Netherlands to do our own occupation of the Amsterdam harbor. Now, like Germany that asked the question after Copenhagen, where does climate change happen in our own backyard? The Amsterdam harbor is where climate change is happening in our own backyard. It's the biggest benzina, like
Oil?
Gas, petroleum port in the world. Something I'm not very proud of that we're best in. And the second biggest coal opslag storage of Europe, and the first is Rotterdam, so it's also Dutch. So it was an ideal place to name and shame, and we did it on a strategic date 2 years after a historical court case against our Dutch state for violating its society with its policies. So basically holding it accountable for the omnicide that follows out of their policies. And we won that court case, and that court case was a big precedent, but it was still an NGO or foundation-driven court case with civilians joining. So I'm going to get to your point of getting together with the workers, because something extraordinary is happening in the Netherlands, is that we're actually as a climate movement, with our first occupation of the harbor, we reached out to the union. Within the union of FNV, which is a big union in the Netherlands, there is a Klimaatwerkgroep. And since 2015, they're kind of discussing like how they're going to deal with climate from a union perspective. And Greenpeace has been talking to them, and they've kind of been soft partners of talking to each other. But now we were going to do a hard action where we're going to cut fences and walk into the territory and put our flag in soil and occupy it, which is can be perceived as threatening to workers. So just earlier this year, five of us climate activists, we decided we've been fighting so long for intersectionality in the climate movement, but we're not seeing it anywhere. We're starting our own little intersectionality working group, and we're gonna fight for liberating lives, not limbs. Just not going for the particle, but going for the whole thing. And somehow we ended up at the table at Code Rood at every session. We ended up at being at the table with mobilization, we ended up with our look and feel, we ended up with the panel session that we hosted at the camp. And the effect of that was, one, we reached out to 150 organizations to give 5 entry points of joining our action, to underwrite our manifesto, to come visit us at the camp, to join the legal demo, or to join the direct action. And so with the union that hasn't done any action themselves yet, this was a quite precarious relationship of doing a reach out. And I handled that first email and that call back and the second call back, and I talked to one of the guys there, and they let us know, like, okay, we discussed it, we wanna send to our people an email that your action is taking place, but we cannot underwrite your manifesto. That's just one step too far. The people of our group are not there yet, and swap. And maybe 3 of us can visit your camp. Awesome! This is a dialogue. So as we're moving ahead in mobilization, we decide to facilitate more people who are not on board with the climate justice, direct action, cutting fences, and everything we want to have at our camp. We're going to have a panel of discussing exploring inequalities and building better futures. And we invite the University of Color, which is a group that fights the colonization curriculum at universities and the general decolonization of our minds in capitalist culture. And we invite We Are Here, which is a refugee organization of refugees, not of an NGO. And we invite the union, and they all showed up. And I'm not going to say that conversation was one where we all nodded at each other and said hallelujah, because there were fundamental differences in our analysis and our approaches to pick up this struggle. But we were all sitting at the same table at the most radical climate justice action camp that we ever held in the Netherlands. So that was truly exciting. And to wrap that example up, there's a fundamental difference between how the coal unions or the unions in Germany are facing the climate activists and what is happening in the Netherlands, because already like the Greenpeace and the unions are talking, and now also the radical activists and the unions are talking.
Very, very stylish helicopters.
Yeah.
The army.
The black and
Not normal ones.
yeah, they're not cops. Interesting. Okay, sorry.
Surveillance break. Wait.
Shouting break.
Yeah.
Okay, look, come on, let's continue.
Yeah, this is exciting. So, so recently they did the union themselves, from their own initiative, they did a commercial, and it's a commercial where you see a little girl in a meadow, and the voice says, you know, climate justice, who doesn't want it? You know, like, after all, this is for a better future, this is for her future. And basically asking the question, who wouldn't want that? And then you see a man in an overall walking up the hill. Well, maybe him, because he works in the mine, but he's also the father of this little girl. And so they sit there together. It's very cheesy, but it's kind of funny. And then more miners and women in suits and people who are in some way working in the extractive industries come walking up that green hill, saying and her and him but we decided coal needs to be phased out, la di da di da. And they talk about that just transition. So they actually started formulating their own just transition, and the climate movement has jumped on board to defend their. They have a kolenfonds, which is a struggle for funding for the people who work in coal, for the workers, because right now big bosses get bailouts, and the millions, like when slavery was abolished, the big slave owners got bailouts and compensation, but not the slaves. We kind of see that happening with big extractive industry as well. Like, oh, poor industry, we give you bosses a couple of billions or millions, but the workers no. So this gives us easy access of fighting on the same front line. And yeah, just wanted to share some experience in Holland of finding common ground that we can stand up for each other. And even though that's not the end of it, finding a line in which we can stand together is really good for building collectivity in our movement over the axis of workers. Yay.
Who's this video?
I don't know, does this event have a link? Because then I could post
Well,
it.
there's the Facebook page.
Yeah, I saw it. Do you know Milieudefensie?
Friends of the Earth Netherlands.
They have the video, a couple of videos up.
I have a suggestion that anyone who wants further information, I can collect a list of emails and we can send all the information that people want. Yeah, so I'll just pass a sheet of paper around so that you can do that.
So I think there should be some questions by now going through your head, or some comments.
Well, small comment. Even that same Friends of the Earth Netherlands, they're working with that same union on the movement of the new economy for a fair and just economy. And they're organizing weekends to build this movement, and they're developing this movement. So that's a nice example as well, which is going on in the Netherlands as well.
So beware, Germany.
Any others?
Yeah, it was just because I really was struck by what he said about that workers in the Netherlands are now like creating their own just transition, and I was asking myself like, what can be done from the part of the climate movement to actually kind of stimulate those talking and thinking about just transitions that take place within the workers' trade unions themselves, and that's not kind of imposed from the outside. Because I think this might be a crucial point, that you actually get workers themselves start thinking about, okay, what is my place, what is my role in that whole thing, and how can we as a trade union or as workers ourselves can create that just transitions for ourselves.
Shall we have a little?
You can happily collect some more.
Some more, and then we'll come back, and then we'll have another round.
Can I just add to the
Yeah.
Dutch theme?
Please.
I was at the every 4 years there's a conference resolution being written by the whole of the union in the Netherlands, and I was a delegate that got invited the conference resolution is being amended, and there were several amendments including a just transition. And the thing that stood out actually was that the people who were advocating this and saying we really need this for the future of our country, the future of the world, for our children, for next generations, are actually the same people who had fought in different areas for labor rights, for healthcare, and for education. Louder. These people had already known how to struggle for their rights, but they saw the bigger picture. And these were the people who were pushing the hardest for a just transition, and to have the entire union and the board members of the union to implement these lines into the conference resolution, when the board members, who were mostly voted out for a good reason because they're too conservative, and less conservative ones got voted in subsequently, said, no, we can do that in a different place. So they could just shove it off, reformulate it, and make it less exact and less concrete. But these people wouldn't back down. And they said, okay, we're going to take this to a vote. And if people they sensed in the room that people were going to vote for it, they would say, okay, we're going to take it up. We don't need to vote. We're going to take it up into the text. Is everybody okay with this? And then everybody said yes, the entire room of all the different sectors of the country. So this is something that the union activists in the Netherlands really want, even though it looked like we were behind on activism in different countries. So this is actually really good.
And the question about externality. The first thing to say is this mining union that I mentioned, they're actually very good in fighting for their members' interests. Maybe those interests are narrowly perceived, but there's still a pretty rational kernel to their position. They're basically saying, look, right now there's no realistic opportunity to sort of have a different kind of livelihood with a sense of self-worth in these areas, especially in Lausitz where there are no other sort of major industries. And therefore it is in their interest, as they currently conceive it, to fight against this coal phase-out thing. Now, there was a bit of a sense in what you said, not that I'm suggesting that you hold to this idea, but that essentially workers, an old classic socialist idea that workers suffer from a kind of false consciousness in capitalism. But the problem is, I think that it's a little bit presumptuous sometimes to say, how do we talk to the working class about how they reformulate their interests? It struck me, for example, that when you say this in this video, this guy is a worker in the mine, but he's also the father of that child, which means that you're actually appealing to a different part of his interest, of his subjectivity. I mean, I'm a worker and I'm a unionist.
And you're exploited.
And I'm exploited, no doubt.
And
but don't let Rosa Luxemburg hear that. But obviously, yes, I'm exploited, alienated, and all these things. But I'm also a bunch of other things. I'm also somebody with an ethical sense of global justice. I'm also a kind of hedonistic party fag. I mean, I've got a whole bunch of different subjects and interests. What a lot of coal activists, and this may be known, have done is they've tried to talk about the health impacts of coal mining, which in the immediate regions are obviously pretty devastating. In a way, it seems to me that it is in fact right now the empirical and rational interest of the organized working class to fight for the jobs as they currently exist, particularly in sectors as the car industry or the coal industry. Those are some of the best protected jobs you can have in Germany. If you appeal to people on the basis of their interest as workers, their interest is to fight against a rapid coal phase out. And I'm not even talking about the car industry. I mean, Germany is a car industry country, right? Every chancellorship in Germany is ultimately a car chancellorship.
Kneels before Volkswagen.
Always. Kneeling is already a fairly nice. I would have, made some sort of smutty sexual reference, but maybe that would have been inappropriate. But basically, that'd be my hypothesis, and I'm very happy to discuss it. And I know this is now the pessimist in me coming out. I always use the pessimist for smaller events. For the bigger events, I have to be the optimist. But here I'm okay. No, this is really my question. So, okay, hypothesis. If we appeal to people in a country like Germany in terms of their interests as workers, they're going to be opposed to our demand for a rapid coal phase out and a socio-ecological transformation. We must appeal to them on the basis of other interests, say as parents of children, or as people who don't want to be sick, or as people who actually have an ethical frame, an ethical global justice frame, which quite a lot of people do have. I would like to, because I'm still a commie, and it's all like, I love singing the Internationale and Pete Seeger, and there's power in a union. But right now, the power in the unions stands against us. We have to appeal to these people on a different basis, because they have rationally understood their interests as workers, and that, in the global north, is to continue destroying the earth, because right now, you're still benefiting from that. That'd be my hypothesis, and I'd love to discuss it.
May I make just a brief point, not as a referent, as you call them in German, but just as...
Louder.
Sorry, but what about going inside, because helicopters...
So there weren't as many helicopters before when we went outside.
Yeah, I think they will now fly all the time.
Okay.
The demonstration is starting.
Okay, can I make before we go in, can I just make my point, one or two very brief points. One is, can we appeal to workers outside their, their class, direct class struggle interest? I think
interest as workers.
Well, the thing is, there is a conflict between labour and capital always in the fossil fuel industry, even in the deep mines. And if, for instance, those miners were to go on strike, or if car workers were to go on strike to demand better pay or better health and safety, I would undoubtedly, unquestionably support them. Why? Because we as activists tend to fetishize direct action a lot. We're going to boast on Saturday that we've shut down the logistics centre of Germany, but
I hope we can boast that.
But if the port workers, this is an example from the UK. We had in 2007 we had a climate camp at Heathrow because they wanted to build a third runway. It looks like it may not happen. We were not effective in shutting down Heathrow Airport, but a year later, 100 baggage handlers went on a wildcat strike. They shut down the airport for 2 days or 1 day, caused enormous chaos to Heathrow. And I would have absolutely supported those baggage handlers, even though probably most of them would like to see another, runway being built. I think this is the way we can support them as climate justice activists. We won't support you when you want to build a third runway or when you want to take harsher action against climate activists, but we will support you when you go on strike against your bosses for better pay and conditions. And for health and safety, and we should do that unhesitatingly, and that's what differentiates us from a lot of other climate activists who will just say no, we don't care at all. I think we should have this more nuanced attitude towards workers in the fossil fuel industry. On the question of, just one more point, Chihiro said that there's no record of workers taking industrial action over the environment. Well, it's generally true. There's very few examples, but there are a few, and we should talk about them. And one of them was the green bans
in Australia.
Yeah, in South Australia by the South Wales Federation of Unions. We can understand that didn't happen overnight. That took activists, socialists working in the unions, working hard for decades in order for that to happen.
The green bans, which were a policy, I'm going to continue with my pessimistic thing. Green bans, which were a policy that Australian builders, the building union, for example, in the 1970s, had in Australia, that they wouldn't work on any projects that were sort of environmentally and therefore from an environmental justice perspective hazardous or harmful. Now, when you say one of the examples are the green bans, and when you said one of the examples, I was speaking with you in my head, saying the green bans in Australia. Because the problem is, they're not one of the examples. They're the example. The definite article in the singular. And that is not quite an accident. Plus, that situation was the situation then was a super sort of highly saturated labour market, extremely low unemployment rates, and strong union power. Now, the trade unions that we have today in our countries have either been beaten to a pulp, which doesn't generally make you particularly capable of reaching out to other positions, or like in Germany, they are basically just the sort of subaltern arm of Germany's export model. Like, the question is not, should we work with trade unions on a moral and socialist basis? Absolutely. The question is, given the scarce resources that we have, is it a rational investment of those resources to work with trade unions? Now, we've been trying to talk to trade unions in the climate camps and Ende Gelände continuously. We have 1 or 2 lines of dialogue open, and we invite them to every climate camp since 2010. We've invited them, and they basically they either come to the discussion or they don't. At the discussion, they kind of stonewall. So the question is not abstractly, should we organize with trade unions? Sure, but from the perspective of what a neoclassical economist would call the opportunity cost, isn't there something else that would take us further in the struggle that we can do? So I'm not contesting the absolute need to work with trade unions. I'm asking, what about the relative need? Isn't there something else that we can do? Because we're ultimately I'm not immediately fighting in the sort of the Lusatian workers' interests. I'm a climate justice activist because largely sort of brown people who don't work in big organized industries are dying from climate change, and because in the long term we're all possibly going to have a harder time. But in the immediate interests, it's not the workers.
Possibly a harder time. I like to listen and let speakers make their point before I intervene, but from any reality check point of perspective, we should actually have some sort of notion that the chance of either intervening without us going extinct is relatively small, and that at this point in climate justice struggle, my fuel doesn't come from the percentage of chance that I have as a species to survive a climate catastrophe, but that it's never too late to lead an ethical and valuable life. And when I say valuable, I mean that in the sense, as Vandana Shiva also talks about it, value coming from Latin, from valere, to be worthy or strong. To have a worthy and strong life, I need to be a climate justice activist. And I do that with as much reality checks as I can build in, including the one that species extinction is not something that is just an option, but it's something that happens 150 times every day for other species and is quite likely to happen for us sometime soon.
But, okay, and I'm not disagreeing, I'm just saying that maybe the helicopters are a problem.
Yes, they are. Shall we go?